You want to see?
Oh, it's still on begin shortly. It says you're in the show, though. It says you're in the show. So I guess.
Good evening and welcome to Community Homeworks class on drywall repair. Glad you could join us this evening. Lee will be our instructor and he will show you how to fix those little nasty holes that you might get in your drywall. We're so glad you're here. Please remember that we are a nonprofit, and if you'd like to send us a contribution, that information will scroll across the bottom of your screen. We hope you enjoyed tonight's class. And Lee, who's been trying to make bunny ears behind my head, will now get us started. Hi, Lee. How have you been?
Good. How you doing?
Good.
So, yeah, like Jean said, or maybe she said, this is wall repair. I apologize. First time I've actually taught this class. If you have questions, whatnot, you should be able to put them in the comment line underneath, and hopefully we'll be able to be relayed to us so that we can answer those. We're going to be talking about repairing walls as far as like drywall and plaster walls. I'm going to go over the differences between the two. So most of the older houses, usually pre-50s, it depends, usually have what are called lath and plaster walls. So the lath part of it, if you have, imagine if this is your wall, you have pieces of wood that are separated and they're all over, and then they have these gaps between. And what they do is they put a base coat of plaster on. I drew a picture over here to kind of show that a little bit more. What happens is that as they put this base coat down, it squeezes in between the slats and creates these little blobs in the back. And then they do usually a coat over that, and then they do a finish coat on top of that. So the thing with plaster, lath and plaster is that lath and plaster can be anywhere from, half an inch thick to I've seen it up to almost an inch thick. You'll see why that's a little bit more important later on. So that can vary all over the place. Why is that? Well, back then they didn't have too standardized of lumber, and they may have differences in widths of the lumber. So they didn't really worry about that because they could take that all up in the plaster. So those are lath and plaster walls, and we'll get into that a little bit more also. Then they started going to what's called plaster board. Similar to drywall, usually plaster board is something that's about this wide, and they're in strips usually about that tall. And then that was kind of the precursor to drywall. But with plasterboard, they would put that up just like they would drywall, and then they put a finish coat over the top of it. And then they switched over to what we know today as just simple gypsum board or drywall. Comes in different thicknesses. The most common is about ½ inch. It's just two layers of paper. You got a back layer and a front layer with gypsum in between. And this is actually applied to the walls in bigger sheets, of course, but it's applied to the walls. And then they do tape joints. You can see where this is actually tapered a little bit. So it makes it so that the paper tape can fit inside there, and then they would be able to smooth this out. Hard to see on film or on camera, but this does have a taper down like this. So they make it so they can finish it out and get a smooth wall. Drywall itself, like I said, is usually what you're going to be working with. Plaster these days there are some people out there that still actually do plaster work. They are very, very, very hard to find. And if you find them, you're going to be paying a ton of money. So a lot of times if you're in an old home and you have a repair on your wall and whatnot, you can use drywall pieces. Now, I'm going to explain what to kind of look for on the plaster walls and what happens to them. So a lot of times, the most common thing that happens with the plaster wall, let's say this is your plaster wall, right? And what will happen over time are these little tips. They break off, right? And they break off. And what happens is that plaster starts to separate away from the lath. It starts to push out and sag. And it's usually, you see this on the ceiling. So this is where the plaster is actually separating away from the lath. It will happen on walls too. So you may have an old home where you walk up to the wall and you can actually press on it and it's kind of flexing back and forth. What that means is that, yeah, that plaster has released away from that lath. Why does that happen? There's a couple of reasons. I mean, impact, that sort of thing can happen where, you know, it breaks those little tabs holding it on. Rapid temperature changes. So I've seen it where the houses are cold for a long time and then they kick the heat on and heat it up real quick and those little tabs fall off and then they start getting that separation. So how do you deal with that? Pick on plaster first. So what you want to do, I have a little thing over here. So what you'd want to do is, let's say you have a section of plaster, lath and plaster wall. So what I did is I just put these up. This is kind of representing the lath that's on the wall. So let's say your hole is about that big, or the loose spot. So what you're going to do is you can get a putty knife or, whatever. You want to be careful. You don't want to be banging on it and stuff, because the more you bang on it, the more you're going to be releasing the surrounding plaster from this lock point between these lath boards. So what you want to do is gently pull off the loose stuff. And you're going to get, you're going to work your way out and you'll feel when it's connected, so you want to leave that area that's connected. And I get in there, I just remove all of that plaster. At that point, you kind of have a choice. So what I'll do is, let's say it's a hole like, about the size of a grapefruit or something. So something like this. What you can do at that point is, if you have little scrap pieces of drywall, you can get, a piece and cut it out. You can cut it in a circle, you can cut it in a square, it doesn't really matter. This is the issue though. So this is 1/2 inch drywall. Okay. So let's say you have your piece of drywall and you cut it out. I'll show you how to cut it in a minute. And let's say you put it in your hole, right? And you realize all of a sudden that the plaster is super thick. So let's say your plaster is actually coming out to here. Let's say your plaster is actually pushing out like a 1/4 inch past, or maybe even a 1/2 inch past. Well, there's nothing saying you couldn't do 2 layers. They do also sell thicknesses of like 1/4 inch thick, stuff like that. Can you fill it? Yeah, you can fill it, but it's just going to take more time. So that's the one thing you have to kind of look for when you're doing plaster repair with a hole like that. But if the thickness is about the same, you can use that. I've seen where people actually put a little piece of wood on the back to be able to fur it out a little bit. That's fine too. You can do something along that line, but you want to get so that your patch is just a little bit like a 1/4 of an inch or a little less than your surrounding plaster. What you're going to want to do, yeah.
If you have to use 2 pieces, how do you make the 2 pieces adhere to each other?
Oh, you can do that a couple ways. You can use glue. You can use a couple things. So, moving around a lot. So, let's say this is your patch. And again, you have to imagine there's plaster around this. I can't really do it on the drywall wall over there. So, like I said, if your piece works, fine, you can put it on there. you can use what are called drywall screws. I like the coarse thread, meaning the thread is a coarser thread versus a finer thread. Finer thread screws, generally I always look at them as like for metal studs, but something like this will work. But what you're going to want to do is run that piece in. So what you're doing is, at first I'm just kind of getting it so it's sticking up proud of the drywall. And I'll put my other one in. And there's nothing wrong with screwing in the lath. The one thing, well, I will say this about the lath, is you want to make sure the lath's in good shape. If the lath's all broken and whatnot, that we'll jump over to this other way of how to do it. So the thing with drywall is that you don't really want to puncture through that thin paper that I was showing you, this thin paper here. So as a general rule, you just don't want to overdrive it. Some people will get it to this point. If they're not real comfortable with the screw gun, they'll get a hand screwdriver and turn it just so that it doesn't break that paper. That's a general rule you want to try to keep in mind. So that's enough right there. And it's a little patch so you got your plaster around it. So then what you want to do is you can use what's called a general sorry.
Drywall compound?
Drywall compound. Thank you. Been a long day already. There are a couple of different styles of drywall compounds. So there's basically three styles. There's what I call chemical dry. I'll show you this one here. This is the old thing, but so they have the chemical dry, and this is Easy Sand 5. What that means is that this is a chemical dry compound. This one's saying it's going to set up in 5 minutes. You don't want that. They go all the way up to 120 minutes plus. But it's basically pretty simple. It's a powder. You pull out what you need. I would say, get the higher level, or you can get like a pre-mixed in a tub or something. This is not it, but I mean, you can get a pre-mixed in the tub.
It looks like that.
But you don't have to mix it up. I would probably suggest that if you have a small repair. So with this chemical dry, you put in what you need. They'll say use cold water. You mix it up, and it says for it to sit a certain amount of time, and then to re-stir it up. So that's a base. It's a little heavier. It doesn't shrink quite as much. It's a little bit stronger. It's not necessarily something you'd want to use as the final coat, but it's good to be able to get that drywall, that patch around that little drywall patch in that plaster. It'll work fine with the other plaster around it and whatnot. When you're putting it in, you want to put a hole in the wall?
Sure.
You couldn't put a hole in the wall. So when you're putting it in, grab a couple of these. Gene's over there beating the wall up.
Should I go with you or should I go with Gene? Huh?
Go ahead and stay with me. Yeah, it's good. So
Gene over here putting holes in the
beating
wall. Hole in the wall.
So you're gonna mix it up. You have what's called a drywall mud pan. This is just a little plastic one with metal edges. This is to be able to clean your stuff off. The thing, if you're mixing drywall compound, you want it mixed up really well. You don't want clumps and all that stuff in it. Like I said, read the instructions. It'll talk about what, how you need to mix it, that sort of stuff. The other is you have different grades, I guess, of drywall compounds. So like I said, you have a powder base like that. You can also use what's called a general. It's usually a green lid bucket. This is a big bucket, but you can buy these in small. They call them usually just joint compound, but generally green is kind of your base also. And then you have this
It's gonna
stuff.
have the whole wall gone.
Then you have this stuff here. This is more of a kind of a topper compound. It's a lighter compound. I'm going to use this just to be able to show you what I'm talking about with this. If I can open it. Wow.
Do you want the hammer?
Oh my gosh. So when you get your drywall compound, you know, it's relatively thick. So when you get it, you just get out what you need. But it's going to be relatively thick. What some people will do at that point is they'll just kind of mix it up a little bit. You can put a little bit of water in it, but don't put a ton in. If you put too much water in, it's going to make it weak. But it, you know, a little bit of water and really mix it up good makes it so it's a little more workable. All right. So sometimes all it takes is just kind of moving around in the pan a little bit. Other trick is when you're not using this, put the lid on. Stuff will dry out. I'm not going to totally close it down. So again, we'll go back to this, right? And again, you have to kind of imagine that this is the plaster around here. So I got, you know, I want to make it so I don't have more than, a half inch or 3/4 of an inch gap between the patch and the existing plaster wall. So what I'm going to do is get a little bit, scoop it up like this. And what I'm doing is, I'm going to get another piece. Now, what I'm doing actually with this is I'm really packing it in. I'm not too terribly worried about getting it looking super pretty, but I'm getting it packed in between the existing plaster and your patch. So I'm getting in there, and you can use different widths and stuff with drywall patch, drywall knives. But a lot of times I'll get that, push that in, and really working in. If you have along your edge of your existing plaster, it's going to be jaggedy. So you want to work that in. So say at your edge, you work it in this way, and you push it in there. Now, if you push too hard, it's just going to push right through the lath. But you do that all the way around. You want to make sure that you don't have much in the way, either on top of your existing plaster or on top of your patch. So, you go along, pack that in all the way around, making sure it's good.
Pretend this is the plaster.
I can do that. So let's say that's your plaster. I can get in there. Normally your plaster is not going to move like that. But I'm going to get in there and really push that in. And sometimes what you can do is actually make a little V-notch. And you can get in there.
Can't really see the V-notch.
You can get in there and do that. So this is going to go on all the way around. The trick is you want to get it nice and locked into that kind of that rough edge of that plaster. So you do that first. And again, it's lower than your patch. It's a little lower than your existing. Let's see how well it's going to hold. Let's leave it alone like that. Then your existing wall. At that point, you want it to dry. So a lot of times it's going to take a little while to dry. If it's the chemical dry stuff, again, it's going to dry in however much time they say. The chemical dry stuff, I will say this. So the chemical dry versus like a green lid bucket that's pre-mixed is going to have less shrinkage. So what's going to happen is as this dries, it's going to lose its moisture from that green bucket. And you're going to get cracking and whatnot. That's fine. That's normal. A little less with the chemical dry stuff. It's going to, it's not going to shrink up quite as much. Once that's dry, And, you know, if you're not sure, wait about 24 hours. It's usually really good. It does depend on, you know, what's going on inside and whatnot.
Can you speed it up with blowing a hairdryer on it?
No, you don't really want to do that. You don't want to force it. So just leave it alone. Let it dry. That time you can clean up your stuff. It's the biggest mistake a lot of times people will do is they don't clean up their drywall tools. And it's not a good thing. So you can clean your stuff up.
With just water.
Just water. Yep, water is all you need really to be able to clean this up. So a lot of times this is a 2-coat process. Now, what some people will do is they'll wait for that base to dry. That's fine. Other people will do is if you have a patch in your existing, you always want to have something that's covering up that gap. I'll show you that something. So there's a couple ways you can do that, but anytime you can't just rely on just that drywall, because if you were to finish it off with the topping coat and stuff, it'd look fine for a minute, but it would start to crack. So what you're going to want to do is this is just simple drywall tape. It says sheetrock tape, but it's just paper. You can also use the fiberglass mesh. It has a sticky back to it, and you can stick it over it. Some people will put that on and actually push the compound and what through it. I don't like doing that because I can't really get that filled up, and I end up with a void back there. So I like filling it with my gap and then applying either the mesh tape or the paper tape. I think most drywallers prefer the paper. So what you're going to do is you can, and you can get this set up pretty easily. But you can say, all right, I need, that much. You're going to want it to overlap. You can overlap your tape a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just grabbing something. So I'm going to say, all right, that's the size, that's the length that I need type thing. And you got your paper tape. Wet it down. So you can just have a little bucket of water or something along like that, and you wet it down. And I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but I still want to be able to show you. But yeah, you do want to wet it down. I'm not wetting it down for this purpose. So imagine this is all dry. We've gone past the time as far as how long it takes. I'll get a nice putty knife and just kind of scrape off the excess gunk. Wet this down. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to you have to be able to bed this into a thin layer of that mud. So that green mud or that chemical dry compound will work just fine. So this is going to be a little tricky, but we'll see. So I put a thin layer, and this is not a thick layer at all. It's just a thin layer like that. I get my tape.
How do you know which is the right side to put down?
There is no real right or wrong side, as far as I know. I've always put the seam. There's a seam down the middle. That's so you can do inside and outside corners. We'll get into that, or inside corners. But generally, you're gonna lay it like this. You're gonna lay it in. I'm gonna pull this, and it's gonna want to pull that piece off. So what you're doing in this case is you're bedding that tape into that thin layer of mud. So this is where you want it nice and smooth. You don't want wrinkles in it. You don't want bubbles in it. If you got a bubble or something, work that bubble out. You can work it off to the side or up. That's fine. You would do your other one running across this way. If they overlap a little bit, not a huge deal. You'd have your same patch like this, and you have your other patch like this, and you'd have your other patch like this. All right. You get that all in. A lot of times people are really tempted to start putting their topper coat over it right away. I don't like doing that either. The reason is that you can move that tape around. So I like to give it a little bit of time. Now, because it's a thin layer, it's going to dry usually pretty quick. I like to give it a little bit of time to dry so that when I'm putting my topper coat on, I'm not snagging it and pulling pieces and whatnot. So you tape all of these joints and then you use a topping coat. Again, that topping coat is lighter, a lot easier to sand and all that sort of stuff. You make sure that you have no excess on the edges and whatnot. And then you put your topping coat. And I'm going to show you more on the topping coat on this side, but the same rules apply for this. So that's basically how to do one of these patches on a plaster board. Now, like Gene asked before, how would you attach these pieces if you had a real thick corner or a thick amount of plaster to be able to match up to? You can do it a couple ways. I mean, I've seen it where people just, put a little glue on there and screw another layer of drywall on it. I've seen where people put glue on the back to be able to fur it out a little bit. Like I said, there's a couple ways to be able to do that. Some people just put another piece on and run their screw through both layers and into the wood behind. That'll work too. So let that dry up. And then you'll work on your topping compound. Go on over. So now we'll play around with and you can see this is the paper in a patch that they did before. And you can see, if you look at this, there's not much. This paper came off. Actually, I pulled it off. But there's not much in the way covering this paper. There's just a small amount bedded into it, that it's bedded into. You can put that paper. So let's say you fill that gap. We're talking about plaster walls. Let's say you fill that gap and then you want to be able to put the paper on as long as that gap's all filled in and nice packed in. Well, you can put that paper in over the top. That's fine. So that's another step you could do at that point if you want to. So, like I said, the other part is drywall. So this is your typical drywall. You can see it from the backside. This is, just your typical wall board. That side is the backside. This is a demonstration on lath. So you can kind of see see how that goes through and that little tab will break off. But that's what that plaster does. It folds over like that, and that's what holds it to the wall. This is a patch that they did before. So, right, with drywall compounds. So here's our hole. So you have a hole like this, right? All right. Well, what you're going to want to do is you want to get the crumbly stuff. So this is that loose stuff. So you want to just gently get that loose stuff out. I like to, if you have that paper on the backside, I'll just get a knife and just kind of clean that paper out.
A utility knife, right?
Yeah, utility knife. I'm sorry. Just a simple utility knife. Getting this cleaned out. Now this is a pretty good size hole. So the issue is that you don't really have anything to be able to screw a patch to, like we did with the lath, the plaster wall, because we had that lath there that we could actually screw that patch into. This, we don't have that. So what you want is, you can do it a couple ways. We'll use this. We'll use this.
I feared you're coming back.
We should be close to the wall. I'm dropping screws all over the place. That's not good. So I can get just a little piece of wood. This is a bit overkill, but this is what we have. So it's a thin piece of wood.
Semi.
This is a 1x piece. It might be a little big. Really big. So here's a nice little trick so you don't drop it inside the wall. Sometimes you can do this. I'll put a little screw in the middle. Not all the way through. It's a handle. Okay. Then what I'll do, I'll put a screw above it a little bit. And I'm just putting it in enough to where it's going to hold into the drywall just temporarily. So I have my piece, and normally they are a lot shorter. Let's see if I can actually do this.
I have a short piece over there.
Yeah,
Want me to go find a shorter piece?
you may need a shorter piece.
I have a shorter piece.
Oh, you know what? Just give me that piece right there. That'll work. But the idea is that you're going to be able to push this piece in, and you want it to overlap onto the drywall, the back side of that drywall. And if I had a saw, I'd just cut this, but I don't have a saw. Gene, just give me that piece you have in your hand there. Yeah, that'll work. So you can do it with this too. But I like to have a couple pieces. So again, you can put a little screw there to make sure you hold it. But you can tuck it in like this. This is where sometimes it's nice to have a partner. What you're going to do is you want to line that up and you want to hold it.
Not from behind the wall.
Right. You're never going to get behind the wall. So what you're going to do is you run that screw in. It's going to spin for a minute and you'll feel it grab that wood. And again, you don't want to over tighten it. You just want to get it sunk in. If you punch it through that paper, it's not going to hold anymore. So now it's holding. Now I can take my hand off of it. Now I can get my other piece and I can line it up. I can move it if I need to, one way or the other. And again, you want to get into good drywall. Put my finger behind it. Don't screw your finger. It hurts. And again, I can feel it grab. I snug it up just enough to where that screw is just below that.
And if
this
you had your
existing
screw
drywall.
here, you would have had something to hang on.
Yeah, and if I had a screw there, I can hold on to it. If the hole's big enough, I can reach my finger in there. So there's a couple ways to be able to do that. So now I've got my scrap piece of drywall. So this is 1/2 inch, this is 1/2 inch. And again, with drywall, you want to look at how thick that drywall is. Like I said, most of the time it's 1/2 inch. So what I'm going to do is I have a little jab saw, a little drywall saw like this. Some people will like to cut the hole out and make it a little bit bigger to be able to work easier. Some people like to cut it into a square to make their life easier. I was being lazy, so I just did that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, the piece I need is, this size-ish. I'm just going to mark it.
You don't want to come down because, or would you go this way?
I'll go on an angle. So you can cut it with something like this. I like to cut it with just my knife. So when you're cutting drywall, what you're going to do is you can lay it on a surface and you cut through that top layer, the lighter layer. So you're just cutting through that paper. Just score it and you'll be able to break it and bend it over like this. And then that back side, you can just score that paper. I fold it up a little bit. You want to be on this side. I fold it up a little bit like this and just score it and break that off. Now I got my little piece. I'm gonna say, it's pretty close. Again, this is kind of too big or too small. I'm gonna cut another piece. With that. Oh, you see what I did. All right, yeah, that's pretty close. What some people do is at this point, they'll kind of, but this is the reason why sometimes you want to actually cut the hole straight, so you can get your patch in there better. So you can get in there and cut that down to what you need. Some people will go along and trace it. Ooh, usually the wall doesn't move. Don't do that. You can also cut at a bit of an angle. You can cut a curve. You can do all sorts of things. So you just get that patch down to what you need. All right.
For a beginner, would they be better off to try to square that hole
Yeah,
up a
they
little
would be
bit?
better off trying to square that hole up, and that's where you'd use a jab saw like this to be able to get in there and cut it out. Sometimes that is not the case. So. Getting closer. Hold that. Hold that. Now you got to see what I'm doing here because I'm rough handling it. I'm breaking the paper off the back. You don't want to do that. So you want to be a little more gentle with it than I'm being right now. But for our purposes today.
I highly recommend trying to square it up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely try to square it up. So you're not fighting it like this.
Should we still square it up?
No, no. Already invested, Ian. So I'm gonna get my patch. Cool, there it is.
Oh, look at that.
So, all right, put my patch in. Now, it's a little bit less than around your existing wall. It fits in there fine. So I'm gonna get my screws.
One of the other tricks I've learned in the other classes
Yeah,
is where this board is.
yeah.
Just take a little pencil and draw a line so you know where your board is to put your screw in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that works too.
And just a little light pencil mark so that you know that your board's not over here or over here, but that it's right.
Right in
And
the
you
center.
can kind of tell by
Yeah, I
this.
mean, I'm looking at these where I held
But
that
if
board
this
in.
is your first time, don't feel afraid to take a little pencil and make a mark.
Yep. So I know
Won't
that I
hurt
got
anything.
one in here. I'll run that patch in. I got one in here. I'll
And we
run that.
promise at home your walls won't roll
Yeah.
away.
If your wall moves like this, you got other problems. So I'm pushing that in. It's in pretty good shape. Pull this piece off. Now again, we're using like the green compound or the chemical dry compound. And you know, I'm smearing it in, I'm mashing it in there. I'm not really covering the whole thing, but I'm filling those gaps. I'm getting in there and I'm filling that up along like that. All right. You notice I'm cleaning my knife off as I go. So if you go through and you say, yep, see this little gap right here? I didn't get some. So you may have to work that in. And you see how I'm coming at different angles. And I'm packing that mud in. So on the back side, if I were to look at the back side, I bet you'd probably see it starting to ooze out. That back side a little bit. Is it?
Yep.
Yep. So it's oozing out. Yep. And that's similar to like what I was showing with the plaster. So that's gonna, hold
And it's
in.
just fine.
So
Nobody can ever see it.
right. No one's ever gonna see that. So
Tripping on drywall pieces.
don't trip on drywall pieces. So at that point, I want to go through on my wall and I want to clean off any excess mud. The less sanding you need to do, the better.
Do you want to, at this point in time, cover your
You can, yeah. I'll leave those there for now. So I'm going to go along now. I'm going to get my tape.
Oh, I'll go get it.
Tape's right there. I got a little piece. This is that. So I'm going to get my tape. And I'm going to say, all right, yep, that piece I made before, that'll work. So I'm going to put that thin coat on. In this case, because this is kind of a small patch, sometimes what you're able to do is you're able to put a thin layer and you're able to I wet this down. I did. I'm bedding that in.
We do not recommend licking it.
Yeah, don't lick it. So I'm bedding that in. I'm making sure I'm over my gaps and this sort of stuff. Pushing it in like this. Pushing it in like that. I'm making sure I don't have a little tab like this where there's no drywall mud behind it. So if that's the case, I'm going to get my mud and I can even work in a little bit behind it and bed it in. So that tape's getting bedded in, nice and smooth. Looks good. Here's my other piece. Put a little thin layer down. And I'm laying that piece in again, covering those gaps. This piece probably should have been a little longer. See now, see that how it wanted to fold on me?
And they don't have to overlap.
Yeah, they don't necessarily have to overlap. You can overlap them, but the issue is,
You got a bump.
yeah, you got a bump to work with. So at this point, you know, you're covering all your gaps. Clean my knife off. And remember, this is with the green or the chemical dry stuff. I'm going to wipe off all this excess stuff. By wiping off the excess stuff, it makes it so that I have less to sand. Now I can go ahead and cover my nail holes, pack it in, and work that in like this. All right. So that's your first step. Now, I'm going to pick on this knife. I do want to point this out. So you saw as I was working, and I'll have you do a side shot. See how this knife has a little bit of a bend to it? And it's flexible. I can make a nice, I can hold it and bend it. And that's going to make it so that there's a nice, relatively smooth finish. So these two putty knives, they look the same. They're not. This one is thick. You can't bend it. You can't flex it. It's going to be harder to get a smoother finish. So a nice putty knife or mudding knife is going to be flexible versus a knife like this. If this is all you got, you can do it with it. It's just going to be a little bit harder. So that's a slight difference with those putty knives. Now again, realize that this is dried. We're just doing this to kind of rapidly get it going. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the blue stuff, the topping compound. And I'm going to get out what I need. I'm going to mix it up. And again, if you want a little bit of water in it, you can do that. And mix it up right in the tub. Yeah, just, I'm talking, you know, really small amounts. Mix it up real good. Because you don't want it too thin. Too thin is not going to work. Too thick is annoying, but too thin is...
impossible.
Yeah, it just loses its strength. So the thing with the topping compound, and yes, can you do it with general green or joint compound? Yeah. There's other small issues, but as general, yes, you can do it.
Is spackling compound the same thing?
No, I'm going to get into spackling compound in a minute. So spackling compound
only have
is
10
totally
minutes.
different. You only have 10 minutes left? Okay.
Oh, you can go 15 or 20.
So this is a real wide knife. So if you look at this, and you probably can't see it, I'm going to go back over to the whiteboard over here. So with these wide knives, if I was to look down it this way, what you're going to notice is, so if I'm looking down, or I'm sorry, I'm looking down on it this way, I'm going to notice that that knife, this is over exaggerated, has a bit of a bow. It bows one way or the other. That's important. So what you do is if you look at a nice drywall knife, you look down it like this, and I can tell that this one's bowing out this way a little bit. That's important that you want to know that. Some people will put a little X on the side that has a bow just to help keep them straight on what side has the bow. So why do you need that? So this is for finishing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, that's my bow side. The bow side is the side I'm going to get the drywall compound and pick it up. Keep your stuff clean. Don't let chunks of guck fall in there. The reason is that when you're doing this finished coat, you don't want things in there. So what's going to happen is it's going to give you this line. If you have a piece of dirt in there or something like that, it's going to drag a line across, and it's going to be a nightmare to kind of get out. So get my mud. Finishing is one of those things that is more of an art form. So I'm holding it like this. I'm placing it. You might be better on this side. I'm placing it like this. So in the middle. So that hump, what that hump does is it actually applies more compound in the middle, and it feathers it out on the edges. So I'm going to hold it, and I'm going to kind of push it in. And you can kind of see how that feathers that out. See how it's kind of pulling like this and doing this sort of stuff? This is where I like to thin it out just a little bit. It doesn't have a tendency to do that quite as much. And you're not applying a ton of pressure. And if I were to look closely at this, the center is actually humped up. I clean it off like this. Yeah, you can't really tell. I clean it off. I get a little more on there, and you want it covering the whole blade like that. Can you do it with something like this? Yeah, but you're going to have a lot of work. So that's where having a wider knife like this is good. So I've done my first coat. You can do, a second coat like this. Some people will go along and they'll work that in. And again, light hand. Now, see this scoring? See all that stuff? That's where crud got in here. So if you notice, like, see, you pull it and you have these lines, a lot of times I'll find whatever the culprit is and flick it away. Clean it off.
Dangerous. You're flicking stuff everywhere.
Yeah. I clean it off on my pan. And again, I'm looking for that X. I'm looking for that curve. So again, that little X on there makes life a little bit easier. And what I'm doing, very light hand. I'm just kind of, what I'm doing actually now is I'm kind of putting a little more pressure on the outer edge. So I'm putting a little more pressure on the outer edge and barely anything on the inside. See, I'm just pulling off just a little bit. This one may be really hard to see. So you can see this one, how this is really faded into the wall here. It's a real smooth transition. That's what you want versus something like this. I call this a hard edge, where you can actually see that edge. That, no matter how much you sand it, it's going to be hard. And this is what it ends up looking like here, So, something like that, it just means either A, you're going to have to sand this or push that patch out even more. So what some people will do is they may do it with a knife like that. Other people may get the center kind of covered, and they may go over it with a knife like this and just kind of smooth out those edges just a little bit. Again, light hand, and you just kind of get that smoothed out. You want to get it relatively smooth. You can, you can only work with it for so long. You let it dry.
If you overwork it, you're going to...
Yeah, if you overwork it, you're going to have problems. So, sanding. Well, I can't really get into sanding. You want some kind of a sanding block. This is actually a sanding screen, all different grits and stuff. If you have huge lumps and bumps, something like this, yeah, you're going to need a sanding screen that's pretty heavy grit. I can get in there and be able to sand that out. I can go to a finer grit for smoother and smoother. If you use just a heavy grit, what happens is once you paint it, you end up seeing those sanding lines and stuff. But so let's look at this patch here that they did before. So this, I can feel that hard edge. I say a lot of times what your eyes can't see, your fingers are going to tell you. So So I run my hand along and I can feel a hard edge right here. So I get that sander and hit that edge ever so lightly. Okay, and that's gone. Hit that edge, run around, hit that edge, right? Then I run like this. And what I'm doing are long sweeps to be able to smooth that out. Yeah, it creates a lot of dust. You want to be wearing a dust mask. I'm not, but you want to wear a dust mask. And you may have to, you know, there's something saying, you know, you may sand it and then realize you got dimples and whatnot. Fine, you can put another coat over the top. What I like to do is get the dust off of it. I get all dust off and then I'll apply another thin coat of that topper coat and then sand it down. So then what I do is I'll run my hands over it. A lot of times I just close my eyes and I'll feel those little spots and I'll get a pencil and I'll circle them or whatever and patch them or sand them depending on what it needs. Another little trick I'll do is, let's say you've done your patch and you got to paint your wall and stuff, right? So you sanded it, you filled it, you run your hands across it, feels pretty good. Put a primer coat of paint on it, let that dry, and then just get a trouble light or something like that, or just take the lampshade off the lamp, and you shine it, you get a pretty strong bulb, and you shine it on the light. Or you shine the light on the wall and you look down the wall this way and it will show little imperfections and stuff. And then you can put more of that topping compound if you have a spot that you missed or it looks really crazy. You can do whatever you need with that and put it right over the primer, sand it, put your primer coat on. Then if you're happy with it, you can go ahead and paint your wall. So the patches, like I said, there are a lot of different styles of patches out there. Grab a couple. You have patches like this, where they come in variety of, this is a self stick. You peel it off, and it's got the mesh in there, and you stick it on, and then you put your drywall compound over the top. So they have a couple of different varieties like that. They have other nice little tricks. So here's a nice little trick I will use. So let's say you get back to that wall. So let's say you had a hole. And let's say you have access to a hole saw. So got that energy. So let's say that's your hole right there, right? And you got a hole. That's your hole, right? What you can do is you can get a hole saw and I can drill out. Doesn't have to be this size. It's just the size we had. All right. So there, I get a nice clean hole. I drop my hole saw on the ground. Not good. So then I get my scrap piece of drywall. And what I'm doing is I'm going to cut out a piece. And I don't have my knife. I'm going to bring my stuff over here and do it over here. I'm going to quit dropping knife. Quit dropping this.
Is this a big enough piece of drywall?
No.
Bigger than the hole.
Maybe. It might work. Oh, no, it's not going to work. This is a weird hole saw. Won't say that. There it goes.
And why wouldn't this work? It's bigger than the hole.
I'll show you why. Where's my knife go?
Bigger now.
Oh.
I was cleaning it up.
So let's say, this is my patch. I'm going to cut this. And then I'm going to cut a chunk a little bit bigger.
Cutting drywall is the most fun.
Yeah. So I'm going to get a piece like that. What I'm doing is from the back side, I'm going to get my hole saw, put it in this drill, and hopefully it stays in the drill. So this is a trick right here. So what you're going to do is very carefully, I hope I don't throw through the floor. I'm going to cut through. I'm going to cut through. I'm not cutting all the way through. I'm just getting it. So I'm scoring through the back side. All right. And I'm going to go like this. What I'm doing is I'm scoring that paper on that back side. And ideally, what I can do is I can break it. Right? I can break it like this. And now what I'm doing is I'm peeling off that front paper. Not quite right. Kind of rushing this, but this is mainly just to show you this nice little trick. So I'm peeling this off. I'm peeling this off. Peeling this off. Peeling this off. I'm going to clean up the edges a little bit. Sometimes it kind of tumps out like that. So now I have this piece that is a nice little hole, but it's got the paper from the front side. Looks like this. And the idea is, clean this up a little bit, square this up some, get that jaggedy paper off. So ideally what I can do now is I can take that patch and I should be able to fit that in. Got a little bit of extra there. Should be able to fit that in like this. These little chunks. And I can pull it back and I can put my mud in. Normally you'd have your mud put on. You'd have that excess paper like this. But it's kind of takes the place of the joint of the tapes. So it patches the hole. You put that in, and again, this size hole I wouldn't recommend. It's usually a little smaller, and then I can mud this in and do my mud all over it. Yeah, I can do that. Got a little bit.
Are we done with the big one?
I don't know. So in this case here, I can kind of spread it a little bit. Pull up the edge, spread that a little bit. And pull back that edge and spread that a little bit. Pull back this edge. Pull back this edge. Then I work away from the edge. I'm bedding that tape or that mud, that paper into see how that's curling up a little bit? I can just peel it up, put a little back behind it, bed it in, just like that. Again, this may be pushed in a little bit. That's fine. Get my excess off, let that dry, and then I can go ahead over it just like I did there. But that's kind of a nice way to be able to do that too. So there's a lot of little tricks you can do. The thing with the wall repair usually is that what ends up happening is you end up sanding a lot more than you think you're going to have to. You know, usually when you start out, you have to put a little bit too much on, and that's fine. Some people don't mind sanding. Other people, it drives them crazy. Just realize that the stuff is going to shrink down a little bit. So like I said, topping compound is not going to shrink down quite as much as a little different mix in it. So it's not going to necessarily shrink and crack. And it's a little bit finer too, so it gives you a little bit smoother finish. But yeah, I said a couple of different ways to be able to do those patches, depending on what kind of wall you have. Whether it's lath and plaster or just a standard drywall.
How do I check in plaster or plaster board if the top coat is textured? How do I...
Okay, so textured walls, that's a good question. So what we've been talking about are smooth walls. Textured walls are a whole different beast. So all the stuff that we talked about is the same. If you have a textured wall, and it can be a lot of different textures. Sometimes it's called a knockdown or an orange peel texture. Sometimes it's like the swirls. What they do is at that point, you know, let's say this is a textured wall. I'd go through and I'd sand this down, and then you can put a real thin coat on and try to match that texture. Like let's say it's a swirl texture or something along that line. They do sell different tools that can make it so that you can match it, but that can be difficult. The texture, the knockdown texture is basically where, in a sense, what knockdown texture is just drywall mud that's been thinned down and splattered onto the wall. You know, it's run through an air compressor and it's splattered onto the wall like that. So you can see what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a mess. But it's basically just splattered on. I've seen people dip it into paintbrushes. I've seen people, you know, do it on their fingers and flick it on like that. And they let it sit for a minute. And it will dry to a point. And this is not going to really work out right. But, so that sits for, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. And then they take a tool, they very gently go over the top of it. And it kind of knocks down that bulb finish, you know. It can be really difficult to try to make that look right. If you have a texture, what I would suggest doing is get your scrap piece of drywall and put a thin coat of mud on it and start playing around with how you think that texture looks. And you'll get a feel for how thin you need to thin down your mud. You know, if it's texture like that, how you want to apply it, maybe how long it has to sit so it has that same knockdown. Or if it's a brush or something, you can get a play around with different things to be able to get that texture right. Instead of trying to get it right on your wall, you can practice on a little scrap piece.
Sponges work sometimes.
Sponges, right. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to be applied.
Do I need to tape a textured crack first?
Yeah, you need to tape.
That.
Right. So, I mean, you know, I think you're saying, do you need to use the paper tape or the fiberglass tape? Yeah, you do. One other little thing I want to mention, we've got a couple minutes, but and it's usually in plaster walls, you'll get cracks that will show up in these plaster walls. What you want to do with those is you want to scratch that crack clean, get all the loose material out. And again, it boils down to, you get that loose material out, then you can get like a standard joint compound like the green lid or the chemical dry stuff, and you're packing it in, and then you're making it wide enough so that you can put that tape over that crack, bed that in, and then you're going to finish over the top of that. So sometimes those cracks are going like this, so you can put a piece of tape, you know, to be able to follow that crack. Because again, if you just cover it with drywall mud, it's going to crack again. So you clean it out, usually a screwdriver or something along that line, down to something stable, fill it, put your bedding so you can put your tape or your mesh in, let it dry, put your top coat over it, sand it, smooth it. If you have a texture, try to match that texture. So that's another common thing that happens with those plaster walls. Gene, seeing as I don't have the outline, did I cover everything?
Yes.
Okay. I think we're done.
Good.
Are we done?
We are.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Hopefully I did all right for my first class.
You did a
Well,
great
first class
job.
doing this.
First class doing this.
Yes. If you have any questions that you think of later, you can always refer back to this video, or you can send your questions by email or text to us, and we will get them to Lee, and hopefully we'll be able to help you. This is a great class to come to in person because we have you do all that work. Tonight we had Leela have all the fun. So the other thing that I want to remind you of is to be sure you put down a drop cloth, preferably a cloth one. Plastic gets slippery, but you don't want this stuff to get stuck in your carpet when it is wet because it is hard to come out.
It is all water soluble, but still.
But
Yeah,
it's still a
messy.
mess that it's so much easier to put a drop cloth down.
Yeah, the
And-
dust too is bad.
Yeah.
You
And
gotta
you
think
can-
about that.
You can roll that up and clean it out later. The other thing is you really don't want to clean your tools like in your kitchen sink. It'll hook up your pipes, take it outside, scrape out, what you can that you didn't use, throw it away.
Yeah, don't throw it necessarily
Don't
back
put it
into the
back in
bucket
there,
because you're putting contaminants back in.
Well, and it's like Lee said, all those little things that made the lumps and lines, you don't want those back in there. Take one tool to clean the other tool.
I want to show you this real quick. So when you're getting ready to put your stuff back, and let's say you're not going to necessarily, let's say you have a tub, even a smaller one than this, right? So you look inside this stuff, see how you get all the stuff on the side here? So what you want to do is, if you're done with it, you want to go around and scrape those sides down each time, put it in the center. And sometimes I'll even get it down to where I kind of smooth it out a little bit. Sometimes, especially if I've had the bucket open for a little while, I'll add a little bit of water in it. But it makes it so that you have less stuff on the side, these hard crumblies that are going to fall down in it and cause you problems later. So, yeah, anything like that, I'll just go around and clean that side off, put it in, and I put a little bit of water on it, just to kind of cover the surface, just a real thin layer. And then you put your lid on it, nice and tight. And you want to make sure, you can take my hand so I can get my hands. And I make sure that's all sealed up and it's in good shape. You got drywall left on you. Anyways, is that it, Gene?
I think so. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Hope you learned something. And again, if you have questions, please send them to us. And we will offer this class in person when we open back up so that you can come in and practice on your own. Thanks for coming tonight. We will have another class next Tuesday at 6.
What is it?
Hope you can join us. Next week is weatherization. So if you want to learn how to get your house ready for winter, join us at 6. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.